These two talks are organized by Debates on Europe, which is an organization carried by two German institutions, the S. Fischer Stiftung in Berlin and die Deutsche Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung in Dresden. In Darmstadt. Jetzt in Dresden. Jetzt in Dresden. Ja, das war okay, oder? Now in Dresden. So, and this is an endeavor that has been going on for 10 years already. It started in Budapest in 2012, and I will not repeat all the places where we were. This afternoon, I pointed to a Debates on Europe event in Kharkiv, in Ukraine, very well described by Ingo Schulze in his latest book. I will now instead give a short look into a later, just a year later, I think, or a few months later, a Debates on Europe event in St. Petersburg. For everyone who was there, it became clear that what happened on the 24th of February could happen. It was, of course, no certainty, hardly imaginable, but it could happen. There were a clash between two ways of dealing with history, with Vergangenheitsbewältigung, that took place there on offene Bühne, on the stage. One of the protagonists back then was Volker Weichsel, who is moderating the panel today and who told about the German way of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. A painful one, of course, forced upon Germany, a country that was forced to deal with its past in many different ways. Also juridically. And it was a question of guilt and responsibility. It was an extremely interesting discussion. The other part of that discussion were a couple of Russian participants who were completely estranged to that type of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I will not go into the details of that discussion, but it was clear that these were two worlds that clashed during that event. And this is just one example, one look into what these debates on Europe events have been doing to those who have been following it and been part of it throughout the years. That brings me to the introduction of today's panel, which I will skip, and I will only introduce to you the moderator, which is, I've already mentioned his name, Volker Weichsel. He's the editor of one of the best journals in the world, I can say that, without hesitating, one of the best journals on the world on what is happening in Eastern Europe, including Russia, including Ukraine. Osteuropa. This issue that I hold in my hand is just fresh from the press, and one German outlet today or yesterday, I don't remember, called it a magazine issue for the eternity. Ein Heft für die Ewigkeit. And this is what this journal is very much about. Volker has been the editor of this journal for a long, long time and will now take a firm grip of this panel. And I leave the floor to you. Thank you, Volker.
Thank you, Carl. So expectations are very high right now for this discussion and to me as a moderator. So please, welcome, and my first task is to shortly sum up the first panel in one sentence to find something which is between those two panels. The first panel was somewhat inward-oriented in Europe. The second panel is outward-oriented. So it's about a geopolitical situation of Europe in the situation of war in Ukraine. We will not discuss directly the war, but I think in every sentence which will be pronounced by me and by the three participants, the framing of how much importance is given to the war in Ukraine on its 90th day is already saying very much about our political focus that we will give to this war, to the people of Ukraine, to Russians, to Belarusians in the month, in the years, in the decades to come. So is it for us in Dresden, in Germany, in the center of Europe, something which is for us in the center of everything, of our political life, of our hearts? Or is it one piece in a big global picture, and we have to think about global things and to put Ukraine and Russia and Belarus somewhere in this global picture? Where do we start, globally or on the European level? That's the big question in the background of this discussion. Other questions will be more concrete. I will first introduce my three panelists, which is Sylvie Kauffmann from France, from Paris, now from Berlin. She has been with Le Monde for many, many years of her life and been in many global cities in her career. For a certain time, she has been the editor-in-chief of Le Monde, now still writing, still an editor, and right now she's a fellow of the Richard Weizsäcker Fellowship of the Robert Bosch Foundation, Robert Bosch Academy. Sylvie, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Anton Shekhovtsov, originally, as far as I know, from Crimea, moved to Kiev later in 2014 after the occupation of Crimea, and then moved further to Vienna, where he has been, as a political scientist for several years, a lecturer at the University of Vienna, before he founded his own small institute, which is called the Institute of Democratic Integrity. And he is the director of his personal institute. And the last book he published as a political scientist was on Russia's influence and Russia's financing of far-right parties all over Europe in 2017. And he knew what he did 5 years ago when he published this book and did the research on this topic several years before. Welcome, Anton.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Mark Leonard, who is a journalist, political scientist, and most famously known as the founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, basically based in London, but also in Berlin, in Warsaw, and we had Piotr Buras from the ECFR on the first panel, and Mark spent, as far as I see, the last 20 years thinking about European Union inward relations, the future of European Union as a political entity, and then about the European Union in the world, especially in relation to China. And he will start right now with a very short lecture giving us a broader picture on European unity and the European Union task in a globalized or deglobalizing world. We will see that in the shadow of the war in Ukraine. Please, Mark.
Guten Abend. It's a große Ehre here to sein. Thank you very much, Volker, for introducing me. I'm very happy to be here with the Fischer Foundation and the German Academy for Language and Literature. I just got off a plane about an hour before we started from Davos, where I have spent the last few days up on the Magic Mountain with a lot of the world's plutocrats and leaders from all sorts of different corners of our planet. And one of the people who kicked off the discussions was Volodymyr Zelensky, who was beamed in his now familiar military fatigues and talked about the war. And he used the phrase which you had to frame this about it as being a war of values. And lots of European leaders came and went and spoke about things in very similar terms. But what struck me in a very profound way was how little resonance that framing had with any of the other leaders from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America. In short, most of the world's population, their leaders did not somehow find that way of framing the war that's going on either persuasive or even interesting. And I'm going to talk a bit about how that might have come about. The war in Ukraine is something that has obsessed us in lots of different ways and has held a mirror up to Europe and shown early on that we have a big problem with power. A lot of the focus in the public prints, not least in the Zeitenwende era that we're going through, has been on the hard power deficit and whether we should spend more money on military equipment for ourselves, for the Ukrainians, for others. But what's often less discussed is actually Europe's soft power problem. And I think it's arguable that that's both more profound than the hard power problem, but also more insoluble. And I think that's because the various different competing identity projects which we're seeing in Europe at the moment, which I'm going to talk about later, seem to be deeply alienating to the rest of the world. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I came to this realization. It's a very personal story rather than an academic one. And it takes place across 3 acts, but hopefully it will have some wider significance which people can use to have this discussion which we've been asked to have. So Act 1 is about Europe's escape from history. And for me, it's about my own embrace and discovery of a European identity. I'm the child of a British father, a German Jewish mother who was born in hiding in France. And it's my European identity which gives shape and meaning to my fragmented and multilingual family. National identity is very difficult to disentangle from blood and soil, but a multinational identity, by contrast, is by definition multi-ethnic. And therefore, because you can't link it to any particular part of the world or a particular kind of blood, it has to be defined in terms of laws and in our title values. And it's also peculiar in another way. All identities tend to define themselves against an other. But to the founders of the European Union and to very much to people like myself, the primary other for Europe is not some foreign entity, but it's our own past. The entire European project is an elaborate attempt to transcend a history of nationalism and genocide in Europe and imperialism in the wider world. And the new European identity, which has been crafted since that project began, is embodied in the embrace of civic principles. International law against power, liberal democracy against populist majoritarianism, privacy against surveillance capitalism, human rights against surveillance states. And in many ways, if we look at the recent French election, the platform that Emmanuel Macron stood on was, in his own mind at least, seen as the sort of ultimate embodiment of this enlightened civic identity. But in many ways, I think it's the success of this new kind of European patriotism which has fueled a counter-revolution from many people who thought of themselves as the majority and now feel that their identity is being threatened by globalization, by European integration, by migration. And that really brings me to Act 2, which is Europe's escape from the rejection of history. And for me, this is something which came to life in a very painful way in 2016 with the Brexit debate, but it's alive and well in many other places. And again, if we look at the recent French elections, you had the perfect physical embodiment of this way of looking at the world in Marine Le Pen, who got 41% of the votes in the elections. And she presents Macron as a globalist agent of death who is administering France's and Europe's cultural suicide. She talks about how France should be much more concerned with the forgotten farmers and workers than economic elites or Ukrainian refugees. But what happened in that French election is happening in many other places where you have a quest to take back control by majorities that feel threatened and who are pushing back against the openness and the internationalism that lies at the heart of this new European identity which I was describing. And that brings me to Act 3, the return of history in Ukraine and my trip to Davos, and the fact that people in many other parts of the world are framing the crisis that we're living through in fundamentally different ways to the way that we are as Europeans. And I can't help but wonder if this has not got a lot to do with these competing identity projects, which are growing in this dialectical way and which have defined much of our politics for the last few years. And I think what's shocking, but puzzling and fascinating to me is that both of these variants of the European identity, the Macron one and the Le Pen version, seem to be equally alienating to the world outside. And the combination of the two risks creating a real crisis of European power. The problem of the international perceptions of the Le Pen vision is pretty obvious. It's not that surprising that 1.6 billion Muslims feel alienated by her Islamophobia, or that the billions of people who think of themselves as non-white are not attracted by the implicit white supremacy of her approach to the world. And even if her attachment to religion and traditional values has echoes in other parts of the world, it's not surprising that this hasn't become a kind of major focus for European soft power. What is, I think, less familiar and more puzzling to many Europeans is how alienating also the internationalist, post-religious, post-sovereign identity which Macron embodies is to large swathes of the world. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. You know, some of it is to do with the revisionist nature of our moral claims. You know, our embrace of the rights of women, sexual, ethnic minorities, our willingness to curtail sovereign power through the embrace of neoliberal economics, the constitutional patriotism of liberalism. They're all quite recent phenomena. And even more recent than that is our embrace of cultural protection, climate protection after centuries of raping natural resources across our planet. So that kind of is obviously annoying to people. Then there's also the familiar charge of double standards and hypocrisy. Many people have not been blind to the fact that Europeans seem to be more interested in welcoming blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainian refugees into their houses than desperate Syrians during the so-called migration crisis of 2015. I think equally suspect in the eyes of many people is our argument that we want to uphold the territorial integrity of Ukraine when we were quite happy to send drones into other countries' airspaces or bomb Kosovo, Libya, Iraq, and other countries in the past. But I think the most alienating thing is, in fact, our tendency to universalize our experience. I think there's something particularly frustrating to people in the rest of the world, that we've taken a series of institutions and values which grew up in quite a contingent way as a result of our history and geography, and decided that they are a blueprint for the rest of the world. And that, in some ways, is structurally embodied in the European project, where we have a rule book of 80,000 pages which all countries need to sign up to in order to become members of the European Union. And we use that approach when we look at the rest of the world. We're not actually that curious in other ways of doing things. We see only the way that they fall short from our rule book and our way of doing things. And I recently, and I'll end with this, wrote an essay with Ivan Krastev about how the world is moving from an imperial era in which Western countries saw their ideas and values spread to the most distant corners of the globe, empowered by the success of the capitalist economic model, the revolution in communications technology, this era of universalism, to a new era, which is one of decolonization, in which countries are increasingly trying to take back control and to consume their own culture rather than mimicking others. And I think that the onset of this new era, which is marked by a cult of one's own uniqueness rather than the desire to follow European or American or other paths to progress, has enormous implications for the way that we think of ourselves as Europeans, but above all for the way that we deal with the rest of the world. And I think they're more dramatic for Europeans than actually almost any other part of the world. The Chinese, for example, seem to be prospering in this claim because they're offering people the chance to get rich rather than to become Chinese. And that clash between the sort of universalism and cultural, civilizational mission which Europeans seem to have, and other cultures which seem to be much more respectful of the national sovereignty of other people, I think could end in a very different way to the way that people thought after 1989 when history was ending. And I think it's against that backdrop that this war in Ukraine is taking place, a war which I think all Europeans would agree with the title. They see it as a war about values, and they look at it as the clash between these two different ideas of European identity. But to the rest of the world, I fear that when we talk about values and norms, they're often seen as particularly dishonest ways of defending white privilege rather than facing up to our history in the way that was discussed at the beginning, and rather than seeing them as part of a decolonization project that many people in the rest of the world think is far from complete. And I think that really provides the context for their understanding about our talk about the war of values in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. As far as I understand, the things happening in Europe, what we in Germany call Zeitenwende, so beginning of a new era, is defined in terms of hard power and the end of diplomacy. Because 20 years of diplomacy with Russia failed, and the result was a war. And this war is on basic values: freedom, national sovereignty of Ukraine, and not of Russia as an imperial state with its own sphere of influence. And what you are not proposing but sketching is a policy of sovereignty-friendly form of soft power, or idea of soft power, which I would translate as non-value focused form of diplomacy. So the total difference of what this Zeitenwende shift in era is about. Did I get you right or wrong?
I don't think that's what I was saying. What I was saying is simply that we should be aware of how the rest of the world perceives what we're doing when we talk about values. Doesn't mean we obviously have values. I think the European project, as I said, I wrote a love story to the European Union called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, which was a kind of attempt to capture what I think is so revolutionary and magical about this project. But at the same time, I think we have to be aware of the fact that when we talk about a war for values, when we talk in these sorts of terms, it's not necessarily perceived in the way that we see ourselves acting, and other people ascribe different motives to it. And if we're not careful, we could actually end up completely delegitimating what we're doing in Ukraine, losing the rest of the world. And I think this partly comes about from the period of triumphalism which followed the fall of the Berlin Wall, where we lost our curiosity for the rest of the world. We became very solipsistic. And I don't think that we've actually found a voice which allows us to talk about values with people who are not within our civilizations and within our discussions. And when you go to a kind of strange event like the World Economic Forum, where I've just been, or I went to another one a few months ago in Qatar, the Doha Forum, and I sat around a table with leaders from other parts of the world and watched Europeans talking to them. And, you know, if I wanted to script a way of driving a wedge between them and losing sympathy from other countries, I couldn't have done a better job than write what these European ministers and people from NATO were saying. And that, I think, is something which is quite frightening, because if there is a war of values fought on those terms, I think it's quite likely that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping might end up actually winning them. Not because people are attracted by what Putin's been doing in Bucha and because they're not horrified by the extreme violence, disregard for human rights which is being shown there, but because of the baggage which we as Europeans bring and our inability to frame our experience in terms which are taken seriously by other players. And I think that's something which we haven't thought about enough. And I think it is maybe the next phase of these debates about European identity is actually doing it in a more self-referential way, in dialogue with our history and with the rest of the world, rather than in the inward-looking way that it's been conducted over the last few decades.
I think German Chancellor Olaf Scholz would really like that, because he was just not in Ukraine, where he's not going to, but in Africa. So he's just doing what you want him to do.
Actually, he was in Davos this morning as well.
Sylvie, are you sharing this view? You have been in many places of the world, and you're watching how the war in Europe and how this shift of perception of the world in Europe is going on. And do you share the opinion that let it be in Beijing, let it be in New Delhi, let it be in Brazil, wherever on the African continent, the perception which Mark presented of this war, of this shift, is exactly how he presented it?
Yes, I totally agree with Mark on this. I remember at the beginning of the war, there were those 2 votes at the United Nations, 2 resolutions, and we were buoyed in a way, the Europe and the West, because I forgot exactly the numbers, but only, I think,
41 countries voted
okay.
158, I think, were on.
Right. So the number of abstentions was so, I think there were 5 against, 5 no's, and the rest were 35 abstentions. And we thought, that's not bad. If you look at the figures, of course, it doesn't look that bad, but if you look at who abstained, it does look very bad. So China, India. So we thought, China didn't vote no, that's really good. But, it was a disaster. And we now, after 3 months, we see that in most of those, of that part of the world, which, by the way, is, in terms of population, is the majority of the population of the world, they say this is not our war. So we've done, it's the West's war, or it's Europe's war. And so I think we haven't done a good job of trying to make the case that we think is our case, that it's a war about values, about freedom, about territorial integrity, sovereignty, and it's about the order, the liberal international order that was born from World War II, after World War II. So, yes, I was struck by what Katerina said on the first panel when she was asked her disillusions with the European Union started, and I think many of us were probably surprised to hear that she said because of Frontex and the way we let those refugees drown in the Mediterranean Sea. And well, that's how the global south, as we call it, sees us. So yeah, I think we have to think very hard about this. And that also leads to other questions about this liberal order that we think is at stake here in this war. I mean, does it still exist? Can we save it? Should we save it as it is? Or should we try to transform it? You know, I don't know. It's been, these liberal values have been around for what, two centuries, 200 years, maybe. You know, I think we're really at a watershed moment in our history in Europe, in the West also. I think it's as powerful as 1989 or 1991. I don't know why you put the most important date. I mean, this is, you know, empires don't die overnight, right? So I think we are still in a process of aftershocks of the breakup of the Soviet Empire. I don't know how many aftershocks there will be, but I think we really have to have a hard look at, you know, what lessons we have drawn from the collapse of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, what will happen with this war, what will we do with Russia, what will we do with the global South, what kind of relationship we're going to build with it. Can we save the multilateral order? You know, I think it was mentioned also in the previous panel that the United Nations have been, you know, nowhere in this crisis. The Secretary General went to Kiev very late in the war, and you know, of course, it didn't serve any purpose. So I'm sorry, I'm only asking questions, but we're really in the middle of this crisis, and it's we have to look at how we get out of it and what do we want to build on it.
I personally have a very different opinion on what is going on and how we should tackle it, but it's not my task to answer now. But it's Anton's tasks. So how do you perceive what is going on in the world? Why so many nations are seemingly at least saying this is not our war, or perhaps even say we are on the side of Russia? And do they really say that by abstaining in UN votes? And what should we do about it?
Thank you very much, Volker, for this question. I'd like to start answering it by pointing out that I think what we've heard on this panel is basically the discursive shrinking of Europe. So, you know, as a Ukrainian citizen, I see that, well, first, the EU totally appropriated the word Europe for it, basically interchangeably calling the EU Europe, or by saying Europe you mean only the EU. But now also the shrinking continues, and now Western Europe is the only Europe today. Because when Mark talks about colonialism and imperial past, it doesn't really concern countries such as Baltic states, or Poland, or, I don't know, Slovakia, Czechia. And I would say that basically when we were talking about Europe in this perspective, it's just a tiny bit of Europe, which is Western Europe that does have this imperial and colonial history. So I would caution against this discursive shrinking of Europe towards just Western Europe, because Europe is larger. And I think also the problem when we start thinking about how Europe or Western Europe is perceived in a larger world, then we make a mistake automatically, because then there is no discussion about how Western Europe is perceived in a wider Europe. And I think actually there's a huge problem that is at the root of much of misunderstanding of the values that are guiding the European project, or the pan-European project. And as for, again, if we're talking about how we are perceived and why other parts of the world legitimately, probably, are not interested in this war. I sometimes talk to Ukrainians, and I think to my fellow Ukrainians, and I think I anger some of them when they said, well, look, you live in Europe, you must know why is not everybody so united in our struggle? Why is not everybody understand? Why doesn't everybody understand how horrible Russia is and what a threat it poses to the entire world? And I say, look, can you tell me who you would support in the Libyan civil war? And they say, well, we don't know. I would say, well, here's your answer. You are not interested. And why do you think that everybody should just immediately be interested in what's going on in your country? You obviously have this, attention. Yes, you think that everybody should center on your own problems, and this is true for any other dramas that we can find in the world. So I do believe that this disinterest in the war is actually legitimate, and what's going on, and it's a diplomacy. You have to go to different places. You have to work with the ambassadors of different countries. You have to explain to them why they need to support you. And well, this is diplomatic work. This is not honestly. This is not even soft power as such. This is diplomacy. Diplomacy is different from soft power. And one more point. I do believe that if we start thinking about, or if we get into this obsession of how the other parts of the world should look at us, I don't know. Maybe as a Eastern European, I do feel that there is a bit of there's a bit of a patronizing tone here. If we are worrying about how other countries should perceive us, and we have this colonial past, and we need to do something about this. No, I think that Europe just needs to pursue its own interests. And because other countries would not have respect for you if you just think of, okay, so how are we going to improve the situation? No, the majority of the world, the majority, this so-called global South, this is the part of the world that respects power, that respects force. And if you're not projecting this power, if you're not projecting this force, nobody will respect you. For now, I will stop here.
I think I do not need to put a further question, but just let you to react on him. Because this is already a discussion, and every further question would just end it. So,
I mean, it's obviously true that everybody starts from their own experiences. I am not an Eastern European. I have spent a lot of time in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe. We have offices in several so-called new European countries. I'm not sure that it's entirely true that there's no colonial history in Central and Eastern Europe, given the empires which have been launched from those places. But it's a different kind of colonial history to that which Britain and France and Spain and Italy have dealt with. But the thing which I sort of disagreed the most fundamentally with you on, I suppose, is where you ended, which is, I think it is perfectly legitimate for us to pursue our interests and to have interests. And for that reason, it's definitely, I think, not only natural, but it's also legitimate that we should be more interested in, if you're Polish, if there's a war in Ukraine, than if there is a war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a completely natural fact of geography and history that should be much more central to the way that you're looking at the world. And I don't think that other people in other parts of the world will think that it's illegitimate for us to have those interests. But the reason why people are angry is because our discourse has been a universalist discourse where we have claimed to have transcended that way of thinking about things, and our self-image is of trying to escape from a particular kind of history, a history of power projection, of the balance of power, where the kind of brute way that you're talking about operating has at least been abandoned within our continent. And there were attempts to try and help to foster a global order, which was very different from the traditional European idea of the global order, where we thought we could go invade other countries, extract their natural resources, and operate in ways which, with the benefit of hindsight, but maybe even without the benefit of hindsight, we could see were deeply problematic. And I think that one of the things that was so inspiring about the EU as a project, and I don't think it's a universal European project, but I think it's the most interesting thing that's happened in Europe for centuries, the idea of trying to transcend this bloody history based on the balance of power, based on ethnically rooted identities tied to blood and soil into a different kind of citizenship. I think that is something which is a real contribution to human civilization and something which has made our lives measurably better. But I think that the danger is of a clash between that stated goal of trying to create a different world and the world that we're in at the moment. And I think there's a double clash. One clash comes from our blindness and our kind of lack of curiosity in the rest of the world. So after 1989, I think many Europeans did really think that we were at the end of history, and we universalized the experience in Central and Eastern Europe and saw that as somehow a path which the whole world was going on, because there was so much radical change which took place in our kind of part of the world that we assumed that everybody was going down a similar path. And it wasn't. And actually, I think that kind of blindness to the perspectives of other people and a universalization of our own experience, was just wrong and unhelpful, and explains some of the problems that we have in other parts of the world. So I think that is one part of the problem. But I also do think that even though we've been hypocritical and blind and uninterested in what's going on, it doesn't delegitimate the hope that we can create a different way of relating to each other. And for me, that is a legitimate and a kind of noble aspiration, and I would like to push it forward. And for all of Europe's faults and all of the things that we've done wrong in different places, I think that I would be a lot happier, both if that kind of order is something that everyone in Europe can enjoy, including people from Ukraine who came out over many years in cold temperatures, risking their lives to ask for it for themselves. But also, I think some of the things in that could actually be relevant and helpful to other parts of the world. But I think we need to have a different way of talking about it and not necessarily assume that there is a single path to progress, which is, I think, part of the problem which I described at the beginning, and which is so alienating and frustrating to other people, because I think a lot of things that have happened were very contingent. They were a product very specific circumstances, and we built quite interesting things that came out of them, but they wouldn't necessarily be developed by other people living through different historical contexts with other kind of needs and other things going on with them. And that giving other people the respect which they feel that they're due and the space to chart their own pathways, I think is part of ending the kind of colonial experience when it comes to dealing with the rest of the world. But it's also something which I think we're increasingly finding even within Europe, because the way that we related to Central and Eastern European countries was extremely didactic and showed very little curiosity about the indigenous patterns of political organisation, of social organisation, which had grown up and which were largely disregarded, not least because so many people in those countries were wanting to return to a Europe which they felt had been stolen from them and not showing respect to their kind of recent history. But I think that's something which we're kind of having to learn, and where there are kind of new debates going on within many European countries. So I think it could both, as you said it before, I think having a kind of more plural idea of what Europe is within the European continent, I think would be a positive thing. And I think that could be complemented by a more kind of plural, self-reflexive, respectful attitude to other people in different parts of the world. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
This is a very interesting and for me also very confusing discussion, because on the one hand, I think we are having a discussion between two political scientists, intellectuals who are talking from an objective point of view, and on the other hand, I've got the impression that there's kind of a geo-intellectual determination is working. You are arguing from the point of view of post-Brexit Britain, and you are naturally arguing from the Kievan, Crimean, Eastern European point of view. And perhaps, Sylvie, you could help us not to have a French or something like that point of view, but something more.
Yeah, no, I think that's a hard task. Yeah. No, I think we have a contest at the moment between two world orders, right? So the one we mentioned, which is the one we defend, and which is, let's say, to make it simple, a world order based on rules, which should be universally accepted or agreed, and a world order based on strength and spheres of influence. So what we have been not good at is showing why our model is better. And why we haven't been good at it? Because we have not implemented it very well. Like, for instance, you know, that our democratic model is also in crisis. We have what's been happening in the United States, what's been happening in some of our countries. So, you know, we have all these problems which make other countries doubt about the value of this model. Okay, now, I don't think the other model, which is basically, let's say, to make it simple again, defended by Russia and China, is being very successful. I mean, if you look at how China is dealing with COVID-19, if you look at how Russia is dealing with this war, you know, this is not, I don't think, something which makes you dream of, you know, imitating this model. So, you know, I think the competition is open, and it's up to us to win it, or to show that our model can I don't like the word win, but, you know, is still valuable and still worth defending. And I think this war, so let's be positive, I think this is a huge opportunity, because look, if Ukraine wins this war, this is going to be an enormous change in Europe. I think the center of gravity of the European Union is going to move eastward. So you're talking about how Western Europe is perceived. This is going to be a game changer completely. And you can already see that Western powers like France, Germany, Italy are totally unsettled by this war in a way that Poland, the Baltic republics are reacting very differently. They feel strengthened because their views are vindicated. Their profound mistrust of Russia. We didn't want to believe. I mean, and when I say we, I mean most of Western European countries. We had our own models of dealing with Russia, which are now proven wrong. This trade change through trade. For France, it was this dream of Emmanuel Macron of building a new European security order with Russia. All this is completely shattered. So, and I think this is why these Western European capitals are reacting, are so uneasy about all this, because it's very destabilizing for them. And so look at what's going on between Poland and Ukraine. We talked with Piotr Buras during the break about this. I was really struck by how this visit of Andrzej Duda, the Polish president, to Kiev, and the warmth and the embrace with Volodymyr Zelensky, and this apparently the diplomatic advisor of Duda has mentioned in the Polish media that he would like to sign a treaty with Ukraine, which would be the equivalent of the Traité de l'Élysée, the Élysée Treaty between France and Germany. So you could, according to how things evolve, how this war turns, and how, that's in the future, what do we do with Russia? That's another issue. But you can imagine a new center of gravity, which would be, that wouldn't be the Franco-German tandem anymore, that would be the Polish-Ukrainian tandem. So, this is something that we can use to reinforce a new model according to our values.
I think you said something very important, depending on how the war goes on. And this was one of my questions to Mark too, not directly a question, because I will put it to Anton, but he already said it. In my perception, these countries, as India and African countries, they are not talking about values or anti-values of the European Union. They are just talking about power, and they are watching how the war goes on, and if Russia will win, they will be on the side of Russia, and if Russia will lose, they will be on the side of the winners. So it's very cynical. They are just watching, and they won't fight against a winning coalition of the United States, European Union, Ukraine, and so on. Which should shift our discussion a little bit to the question of how the war will go on, and what does it mean to win for Ukraine? What does it mean to not to win or to lose for Russia? And which possibilities for the future do you see?
Well, first, I will say that I agree with Sylvie about the shift of the gravity towards more Central Eastern Europe. It's already happening. Because history takes time, we see the shaping of a new constellation, in my opinion. For example, the Three Seas initiative, a new geopolitical bloc in the making. And I would say that actually the war, it does have an impact on the formation of this new geopolitical reality, but also it's not related necessarily to the defeat or the victory of Ukraine, but because it is forming anyway, and it started to form anyway. And I do agree with you that Western European capitals feel uneasy about what's going on and about this 3 months moment of Central Eastern Europeans saying, "We told you so." You know, it's like every day, "We told you so," and basically, these uneasiness of West European capitals, it can be compared to the uneasiness of the patriarchic society losing to the rising feminism. You know, they're losing this. You know, many Western capitals and many Western countries actually funded the regime that is now killing Ukrainians. So the moral authority is gone. What's left there is money. But it's like, again, the patriarchal society is saying, well, feminists, so what we have money, we have power. What do you have? And we know the answer of feminism to patriarchy. So it is happening. And as for how things will develop, well, nobody knows how things will develop. And Ukrainians will fight. The Russians also, they don't want to win. They don't want to lose, because this is also, this is in the nature of Russia as well, not to lose wars. But Ukrainians are very similar in this regard. And I do remember a moment from 2014 when the Ukrainian ship that was in the Black Sea, that was close to Crimea, and then the Russian ship came and they told the Ukrainian ship to surrender. And the reply was from the Ukrainian ship that Russians do not surrender. And obviously they used two different concepts. Russians, they русские не сдаются, meaning ethnic Russians do not surrender. And they said this to the actual Russian military vessel. So sort of, and why I'm saying is this, is that the Ukrainians are very similar in this regard to the Russian aggressor. They're not going to, stop fighting, because obviously they are not. It's not only a fight about for sovereignty or for independence, as we now see. This attack has a genocidal nature, has a genocidal character. So basically, Ukrainians are fighting for the physical survival, very basically, very simple physical survival of the people, and. Yeah, so we don't know how it's going to stop, but I do believe that many of the talks about trying to help Putin to save face. Well, first, I think it's morally unjustified. That if you want to save Putin's face, use formaldehyde, to keep this face of his intact. But then he's not looking for saving the face. He's looking for a victory, and he's not looking for defeat anyway. So for him, it's an existential struggle as well. So all these talks, all these discussions, they are just, in my opinion, they are a bit useless.
As far as I see, the whole discussion about the values in this war is also somehow Western European centered. Because for Ukraine, there's one basic value, and it's at that point of time not the rule of law and not feminist values, but it's just sovereignty and surviving. So my question is, what signal does Europe send, or Western Europe or Western European capitals send to the world when they are looking for the opinion of, let's say, Indian people, not looking to a country which is basically fighting for national sovereignty, whereas you said that for them the most important thing is sovereignty against European post-imperial, post-colonial, new colonialism.
I don't know, you said quite a few things which I found confusing. One thing was that we stand for values, but the rest of the world is only interested in power, which is a very kind of weird way of looking at the rest of the world. I actually have yet to go to a country, and I've been to many, which doesn't somehow anchor its national identity and its sense of itself and the identity of its people in values. And I think that there's something really problematic if you think that we're the only people who have values. I think that what we're talking about is different ways of embracing and hierarchizing values. If countries have been through a colonial experience, that puts the, if you look at the kind of hierarchy of values, the most basic ones are about survival and about control, and then you can get more abstract and more post-material once you've fulfilled those basic values. So it's not that surprising that countries that have had no say over their future, that have been part of empires, are very attracted by sovereignty. It's one of the reasons why Ukrainians are so attracted by the idea of sovereignty, because they felt that they lost it. It's why in Central and Eastern Europe, people are more attracted by sovereignty than in Western Europe. If you run the whole world, you're maybe a bit more relaxed about it than if you've been part of an empire where you weren't able to. So I think that, but I think that's one of the reasons why for Western Europe, what's happening is slightly confusing, because the rhetoric in Western Europe about how we dealt with each other over the last 30 years has been about transcending national sovereignty. It's been about removing borders, has been about provincializing the importance of those Westphalian concepts, certainly insofar as our own kind of interests were concerned. And now what you're having is, you're having to go down that Maslowian hierarchy of values to look at the basic survival of the state, because there's obviously a big difference between a country making the decision to pull and to remove its sovereignty and one that's being invaded and being threatened with annexation by other players. But that's quite a confusing shift of discourse. If you have a situation where for the last 40, 50 years, the main problem of sovereignty for Western Europeans has been how to get rid of it, because we were so scared by what sovereignty did to us in 2 world wars, where we almost annihilated not just ourselves, but billions of, well, hundreds of millions of other people around the world. So the project for the EU has largely been about taming sovereignty rather than about reclaiming it. And that's meant that we have been on a different path from most people in most other countries who had been part of empires, who'd been invaded, who hadn't had sovereignty, where what they were trying to do was build sovereignty. That's also why there's a big East-West divide on these sorts of issues, because the Eastern and Central Europeans had this kind of strange way where the way of reclaiming sovereignty was to sign up to a project that was about the abnegation of sovereignty. So there's an inherent contradiction in it. And that's why a lot of Central and Eastern Europeans have been quite happy in the last few years about the sovereigntist discourse from Putin. If you go to Budapest, for example, one of the reasons why Putin is so attractive is because actually he's going back to a kind of older idea of European identity, which is about blood and place and about control, etc. And I think some of these debates which we're seeing at the moment are between different values, different ideas of sovereignty, which are being played out across Europe within our countries. I mean, that's where I started, this dialectical contest in France between Le Pen and between Macron. We're working through some quite difficult things at a time when a lot of the rest of the world has had very, very different experiences. So I think it's quite, it's not easy. I don't buy this. I think, obviously, I think also some of these East-West debates that you're talking about are very contingent. It so happens that Russia is front of mind at the moment, unsurprisingly, because it's invaded another country and created a massive refugee crisis and a massive food shortage crisis and an energy crisis and all these sorts of horrendous implications which we're going through at the moment. But Russia is a declining power. It's going to be ever less important to our lives. If we look at the next few decades, its population's shrinking, the importance of hydrocarbons will have disappeared within 30 or 40 years. So I wouldn't necessarily see the fact that everybody's completely focused on that as meaning that the balance of power within the EU is going to change in a kind of dramatic way forever and ever, that Poland and Ukraine will be the new France and Germany. It's a possible future. I've been wrong about lots of other things, but if you look at the demography of Central and Eastern Europe, if you look at the industrial models, at things which are going on, and also their relative closeness to the rest of the world, the regressive immigration policies, there are all sorts of other social indicators. It's quite possible that other countries in Europe end up doing very well in the future, and that just as we were very focused on the Mediterranean in 2015, that we'll be focused on some other crisis in 10 years. The big story about the world now is actually about a shift from the West and the North to the South and the East. And I think the big story, which my children, who are 10 and 13, are going to be living through, is not going to be a Russian story, it's going to be a Chinese story. And that kind of massive generational shift from a Western-centric world that through industry and empire overtook the rest of the world and shaped a lot of the norms and the practices which we have at the moment, that is what's being overturned. And that is the kind of big generational story which people will be talking about in 20 or 30, 40 years' time. Obviously, what's happening in Ukraine is tragic and is horrendous and touches us in a very deep way. But I don't think this is... I think it's something which is very important for the European order, but I think in global terms, I think that the people that I was talking with in India, in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia and other places are not wrong, that it's not their war and it's not a big deal for them, except in secondary ways because of the way that it impacts on energy prices, on food shortages, and on other things.
May I react to this?
Yeah,
I
sure.
think I agree with you, but I think that the way this war ends is important for our relationship with China. And if Ukraine wins this war, and I think it can win it, because first because they want to win it, and their motivation so far has been really much, much, much higher than the Russian motivation, and also because the US is injecting so much money in this war, and we're talking about the fact that Germany is not providing heavy weapons, but I think the weapons that the US is going to provide is really what matters most, and NATO in general. So, okay, that's the situation on the ground. I'm not a military expert, so I'll stop there.
Point.
But, I think the stakes of Ukraine winning this war and then Europe helping to reconstruct Ukraine, this is another thing which will be very important. How does this reconstruction is handled? Is it an instrument to rebuild a new Ukraine? And you say the values for which Ukraine is fighting is only national sovereignty. I thought 2014 Maidan was about freedom and dignity also. So I would bet that the Ukrainians still believe in this when they are free, when they recover their sovereignty and hopefully their territorial integrity. And so then it's for Europe to rebuild all this in a proper way, including, not only politically, but also economically, ecologically. And then I think the relationship to the balance of power with China will change, or will, as a consequence of whether we succeed in this or not. It will have an impact on this, the geopolitical impact also.
So my impression is that in the United States, they are well aware that this kind of prophecy is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why they are spending so much money, because the relations with China are determined by the outcome of this war. And if the West is part of this war and it loses it because it doesn't want to win it, because it's just looking for what African people think, China will recognize that the West is not ready to fight.
But who's saying that we want Ukraine to lose in order to please
No.
African people?
No.
Like, seriously?
Nobody.
I think that, well, first I want to provide a little bit of correction. I didn't say that the rest of the world does not have, that they don't have values, they only respect power. No, obviously they have their own values. What I meant is that our relationship with them, European relationship, should not be solely just based on we have our values, you have your values, but national interests are also very important. And the projection of power is something that brings you respect of other countries, and obviously the war in Ukraine will have a huge impact on the relationship with China. At the moment, China is not breaking any sanctions. They don't want to have a problem of like this, and they're waiting. Yeah, they have centuries of time to wait and see how it's going to end, and it's anyway a win-win situation for them. If Russia loses, then it will be easier for China to exert more influence on Russia. It's making Russia even more dependent on China. If Russia wins, then it will be much easier for China to exert influence on the West, and also the US in particular. But yes, I do agree that most likely the significance of Russia will diminish, and then the challenge of China will be more obvious. But then if Russia's significance diminishes, then we need to think, so where would be the European-Chinese border in 40 years? And then anyway, the Central and Eastern Europe will play a very important role, because probably, at least in terms of influence, not necessarily in terms of the real state borders, the border between China and Europe will be exactly on the borders of Eastern Europe.
I would like to open the floor for questions for you, but yes, there is a microphone.
Anyway, I felt a bit uneasy. I felt a bit uneasy about Leonard's talk and the drift of his talk.
Please introduce yourself.
If the rest of the world regards our reaction to the Ukrainian war as simply another aspect of Western hubris, it might be useful to have a look at Putin's allies. There are not many of them. There is Kadyrov in Chechnya, there is Lukashenko in Belarus, there is Assad in Syria, all of them slaughterers of their own people. Of course, let's be fair, the Russians are quite right to feel threatened by the West, for the West goes in for all sorts of things that would be ruinous to his own system. We go in for freedom of the press, we go in for a free and impartial judicial system, we go in for parliament system that is more than a puppet theater. All of this, of course, is unthinkable, and unthinkable in Russia and unthinkable in China. And I wanted to ask Mark Leonard, he talked about the blonde Ukrainians, which was news to me. How blonde are Ukrainians on the average? I have no idea. The blonde Ukrainians.
Blonde.
Blonde,
Ah, okay.
This is more a comment, I think, or otherwise a question by Carl.
Thank you. A question to Mark, but basically to all of you. Why can't one do both? Why can't one why can't one pursue a political project based on values, and therefore also frame the war, Russia's war on and in Ukraine, as a war of values, because putting those two systems next to each other would suggest that, and at the same time describe it as a colonial war, as an imperial war, which has a much, because it's clear that it also is that, which has a much better chance of receiving understanding in some of the countries that we have just talked about. India, South Africa has not been mentioned, but was one of those as well. So why can't one do both these things, as pursue a value-driven political project and framing the war as a part of that picture, but at the same time point to the obvious, that this is an imperial power conducting a colonial war?
Yeah, I mean, that I thought was what I was arguing in my. I mean, you know, to be completely clear, maybe I needed to say at the beginning, I'm fundamentally opposed to the re-invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I have worked for most of my life to try and help create sovereignty and a sense of control for a lot of countries that have been emerging from the Soviet Union. I first went to Moscow when it was still the Soviet Union, and have got lots, you know, and I am completely in favor of what we're doing to support Ukraine. However, I think it is also important in a globalized world where power is shifting away from Europe for us to have the ability to look at ourselves from the outside as well as from the inside. And what I was critiquing was simply some of the ways that we talk about what's going on and weaken ourselves by failing to understand what Europe looks like to people outside of our continent. And I have been frankly shocked at how bad we are at actually understanding what the world looks like for most people who live in it, and thereby, I think as a direct result of that, we've done a very poor job of getting people who should be supporting what we're trying to do to support it and to understand it. You know, you had one moment after in the UN after the war started when the Kenyan ambassador to the UN Security Council did talk about the war in those sorts of terms. It wasn't even something which was done by the Europeans. Somebody outside kind of did it. And then, because partly of the way that we behaved, we haven't heard very much from the Kenyans since that debate at the UN Security Council. But, you know, I think that it is fine for us to have interests, to pursue interests, and to do those sorts of things. But I think that the solipsism which has developed as a result of our sense of being a kind of model for the world and our victory in 1989 and 1991 is something which is, I think, troubling and is actually going to accelerate the shift of power to other places and make Europe actually much less capable of thriving and of recasting relationships with the rest of the world at a time when more and more economic power is going to be exercised outside. That's the only point I was trying to make. I wasn't in any way condoning Russian policy towards Ukraine. And I do think that this whole idea of what a victory is and how that's going to go on is going to become a very big debate in Europe, though. And maybe to go back to that point, I think that's something where, in the shock of the war, we've been incredibly united, much more so, I think, than many people expected. I think that there's been a real investment in the Ukrainian military. We have these crippling sanctions which have held up reasonably well so far. But if we look at the months ahead, I think that's when it's going to become much harder. And I think that we've just been doing a big opinion poll. I'm just started to go through the data today, but it's quite interesting that if you give Europeans the choice between these two statements, one statement is our biggest priority should be to end the war as quickly as possible, even if it means that Ukraine has to make territorial concessions. Or the other option is the most important thing is for us to punish Russia to deter future acts of aggression, even if it means that more Ukrainians get killed. You have this stark choice between peace and justice. And actually, in every single country that we polled, and we polled 12 countries across Europe, more people were in the peace camp than the justice camp, apart from Poland. But even in Poland, it's not a majority that was in the justice camp. And I think that goes along with a huge amount of solidarity and a willingness to do a lot of the things that we've been doing so far. But I suspect if this becomes a long war of attrition, which it has every sign of doing, which goes on not just for days and for months, but even potentially for years, that could create a big cleavage within a lot of our societies as well as between them. And it's obviously true as well that the longer the war goes on, the harder it's going to be to rebuild Ukraine. If millions of people already left their homes, I think they're desperate to go back and to reclaim control of their lives. But if the war goes on for 5, 10, 15 years, people put down roots in other places, their children go to school, they develop other languages, it becomes harder and harder for Ukraine and Ukrainians to pick up, to attract inward investment, to rebuild the country in the ways that they have to. And I think that this will be a very painful and difficult set of issues, which above all Ukrainians are going to have to face, because it's Ukrainians who are dying and who've been driven out of their houses. But I'm not sure that we can universalize, the way that we feel now after 90 days, and assume that there aren't going to be difficult choices at some time ahead. It might be in 5 years' time that these difficult choices get made, but I think they are going to be real issues.
As far as I understood you, this was already kind of a perspective as you perceive the war will end or not end. This is my last question. If there are no further questions, Sergei.
I would like to remind us in the context of this conversation that the worst nightmare of the 20th century was the threat of the nuclear war. And 30 years ago, Ukraine was in the top 10 of the countries possessing the nuclear weapons. Ukraine disarmed itself voluntarily. Ukraine made an absolutely unprecedented, in the world's history, contribution to the world's security and world safety, which goes not only to the Western Europe or Eastern Europe, all definitions of Europe. It's the contribution to the world. And now, when it was done, when Ukraine made this sacrifice, what we are discussing? We are discussing if to go to help or in which form to go to help. This is just not in balance to what was done 30 years ago by Ukraine. I would like you to comment on this.
No, I think you're right, but the sin was not now. It was 8 years ago in 2014 when the Budapest Memorandum was not lived up to, and the security assurances that we had given were interpreted in legalistic ways. And I think it was a terrible signal to the world. I think, there are other bad signals, like what happened with Libya when they voluntarily gave up weapons of mass destruction and we then went in and deposed Gaddafi. The signals that we're sending to many countries in the world is that if you want to be sovereign, and then you need to get nuclear weapons. It's not that surprising that Iran, that North Korea, and that other countries are willing to take on enormous sacrifices in order to have nuclear weapons. I think it's a terrible legacy of the last decade of Western foreign policy, and I think it is shameful. And I also do think the fact that we were so weak when it came to territorial integrity of Georgia back in 2008, and what happened when Crimea was annexed, has obviously encouraged Putin to think that he could get away with what he's doing now. And the roots of the current crisis, I think, lie in the inaction and neglect of the West earlier. Lots of other mistakes were made as well. But I agree very strongly with you.
So, Sylvie, what is your perspective for the month or years to come, and what does
Well,
it mean?
I'm
We
still
talk
under-
very abstract
yeah.
about winning or losing the war, but this is a
I'm
very...
still in shock after hearing Mark saying it may be 10, 15 years. So I hope this time you will be proven wrong. I can't see this war lasting for 10 or 15 years. It's I don't know. It's just beyond imagination. No, I think to go back to what Sergei was saying and the mistakes which were made, we discussed it on our way from Berlin to here. It is something very important, the way we're going to look at all these mistakes, why we made them, what lessons we draw from those mistakes. But I think it's really something we have to do very seriously. It's you know, not only for Russia, but also for our relationship with China and for the future. I think we really need to look at those 30 years very seriously and in detail and see why, and see what happened. Then the rest, you know, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground about what we would like to happen. Now, the big question mark also is what will happen in Russia. I have no idea. I mean, if Ukraine wins the war, can Putin survive? I don't know. There's so much of him invested in this war, but what, you know, this regime in Russia, it's so different from the Soviet regime in the way it's structured and the way it works and the way the decision process, and in fact we know so little about the way it works. I mean, at least in the West, it's so opaque that my impression is that it's very, very difficult to make any prediction. I don't know if Anton has some.
I don't believe in these 10, 15 years of war, because basically these sanctions, which are now in place, they haven't even started working, basically. And when they start working, they will have a really, really crippling effect on Russia. And already Russia is not able to reproduce the high-precision rockets and missiles that they had. They can't reproduce the supply anymore because of the sanctions, and because much of the electronics, the insides were coming from the West. And now they are unable. Obviously now they are going into black markets all around the world. But now the Ukraine's allies, specifically the US and also European countries, are now being very, very active in not letting the Russians buy the stuff they need, even on the black market. And this excludes any white market or grey market now. So they will not have, at some point, they will just not have weapons, important weapons to fight. So we're not talking about 10, 15 years. Sorry?
You exclude the option of China helping? Then.
No, because why? I mean, China, as I said, for China, it's a win-win situation. And probably it will be even better for China, maybe in the midterm, for Russia to lose, because China is a close neighbor of Russia, and then obviously it will use the opportunity to move in. I don't know. Some Chinese, they're already there. Yeah. In Russia, in those areas. But I would also like to stress that the decision of Ukraine surrendering parts of its territories, this decision will not be made in London or Washington or anywhere, or Warsaw. It will be done in Kiev. And I don't think that this decision will be made Zelensky does not, President Volodymyr Zelensky does not have a mandate from Ukrainians, from Ukrainian people, to do such a thing. And Ukrainians, as I said, Ukrainians are not going to surrender, because this is I think this binary choice of a party of peace and the party of justice, this is an erroneous choice, because surrendering parts of its territory, it brings genocide to those occupied territories. It's about killing of hundreds of thousands of people. This is not just Ukrainians, if they continue fighting the war, there will be more dead Ukrainians. No, more dead Ukrainians will be if Ukraine surrenders parts of the territories to Russia. We already know what's happening on occupied territories. We already know, you see? And of course, the victory of Ukraine is of utmost importance. And I think the victory should be comprised of 4 elements. First, the total restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, reparations from Russia.
Total means including
tribunal.
Crimea.
Sorry?
Total means including
Crimea is Ukraine. Tribunal that should take place, and Russia not hindering Ukraine's European integration. So 4 elements which I think very important, and that would constitute the victory for Ukraine.
I'm very humble about what's going to happen in the future, because I've been wrong about lots of different elements, including this war actually taking the course that it's taken so far. However, I would caution you to be also realistic about how effective sanctions are going to be. Our experience so far is that they become less effective rather than more effective over time, because people find workarounds. Iran has been under a program of maximum pressure for a decade, and it has not broken their desire to get nuclear weapons, to have a nuclear program. It's not led to the collapse of the regime. It's not stopped them interfering in all of their neighbors and fighting proxy wars across the region. North Korea has been under an even more aggressive regime for most of my lifetime. Well, maybe not most of my lifetime, but for a very long period of time. The track record of sanctions working is quite rare, and usually it's on pluralistic societies like South Africa, for example, where it's been effective. But by and large, the track record of sanctions, particularly over time to have an effect, is not particularly good, would be my first thing. On my second point, I totally agree. It will be the Ukrainian government that decides what negotiations to have with Russia, when, at what point. I do think that the perspectives of Ukrainians will change over time, depending on, I hope that you get the victory that you're talking about as quickly as possible. I would love nothing more than to see that happen. But if this becomes a war of attrition which drags on for a long period of time, I suspect that there'll be some Ukrainians who want to fight until the last person for every bit of land, and others who will just leave and not want to be part of it. And there'll be a big debate within Ukraine. But there will also be debates in European countries and in the US about how much to spend on weapons for Ukraine, on how long we want to have energy prices at whatever rate they're at how much willingness there is to accommodate millions of Ukrainian citizens if the death count goes up and the war spreads to other parts of the world. And it's going to be complicated and messy. I desperately hope that you're right, that you can have the outcome that you want as quickly as possible, and I think we should do all we can to allow that to happen. But I'm also sort of humble enough not to know how Putin will react if it looks like we're moving towards those things, because I think we all want Ukraine to win, but I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin thinks that he could stay on as president if you get those 4 pillars of your victory. And how he will react to that is another unknown, which we're going to have to deal with, and which could be could be very frightening potentially. I don't think we should be second-guessing these things and not supporting Ukraine and doing the things that we need to do in order to help Ukraine regain sovereignty, because we're worried about what Putin might do in a few months' time when things close. But I think we should be at least thinking these scenarios through and working out how to prepare ourselves to minimize the danger of very scary escalatory scenarios from happening.
So, thank you very much. I personally mostly understood from the discussion why the word which was brought forward by Elliot Cohen some days ago in an article in The Atlantic is so important. It's not the perception of what is going on in the world, but it's, as he says, the most important word for us is perseverance, or Ausdauer in German. So the will of perseverance will decide, obviously. So it's a moral war on how long are we able to watch the fighting and the consequences and the victims on both sides, and how much will to persevere do we have? That's, I think, the result of this discussion, and we have all to reflect this. Thank you very much. No technical...